Okay, so I have with me today Deacon Nicholas Kotar, I was going to try and enumerate from memory, but here's so many things. An Orthodox deacon, men's choir director, Grammy-nominated tenor soloist, an accomplished translator, and a founding member of Conquering Time, which is I don't know how you would describe a group of Orthodox artists.
Yep.
Yeah. Which is an interesting endeavor in itself. Maybe you could start by talking a little bit about that and how that ties in with Raven's Son and some of your more, I guess, traditional artistic work, like your writing and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, Conquering Time, it's no longer around. It was kind of a I don't know. It was an attempt at a group of new inklings, but not all of us had the same literary interest. We had all kinds of people. There were musicians, there were philosophers, there were people with no musical talent whatsoever. There were writers, there were poets, all kinds of interesting types. And this was a long time ago. This was, maybe 15 years ago, if not more. Back when I was in San Francisco. I'm in upstate New York now. Way before I was married and all that. This was the early attempts to formulate a kind of a creative movement, a kind of holistic way of relating to the world through story. And at that point, it was more about what could we do with multidisciplinary approaches to storytelling. So there was a lot of on stage storytelling going on with music, with original poetry, original story, original fairy tales, interwoven with both solo and choral music, a little bit of instrumental music. At one point, we had a piece that was two professional storytellers with a single violist, I think it was, this a while ago, and then a soloist singing a dirge at a particularly sad point of the story. The high point of Conquering Time was something that I still consider to be one of the most interesting projects that we've ever done. Effectively, what it was a rewritten Russian fairy tale that I and two other or three other writers put together in four sections, each of which was in a completely different style. So one was straight up poetry, another one was kind of high fantasy in the style of Tolkien, another one was something in between free verse and prose. And we would punctuate each of these sections of storytelling, which happened on stage. And the stage was in a Catholic church, a very beautiful Catholic church that had a wonderful acoustic and a very striking, as it turned out, backdrop. Of course, that's not the backdrop; it's the front drop, so to speak. It's where the worshiper is directing his and her attention, but we were using it as a backdrop. And we'd punctuate that with some new music. Most of it was new church music that was written by modern composers, both Russian speaking and English speaking. So it was in both. Actually, I think it was all in Slavonic, but the composers were mixed. There was at least one that was an English speaker and several that were Russian. And the immediate effect was one of not for me, because I was on the stage doing this thing. I was conducting the choir and I was one of the storytellers, but some of the people in attendance were bishops and highly ranked clergy members in the Orthodox Church. This is in San Francisco. And one of them came up to me and said, well, initially, when I saw the combination between fairy tale and sacred music, I was quite offended. He said, but then I understood what it was that you were doing. And by the end, I was rooting for you and I was completely inside the story. So that was a high point. And it led to further collaborations with other groups and other people and other creatives all over the world, in New York, in Paris, in Russia. And one of those collaborations ended up becoming one of my most productive and most interesting creative friendships. That's with Benedict Sheehan, who is now a multi-Grammy-nominated composer, with whom we are doing some rather interesting work that's going to be coming out over the next year or so. So that's Conquering Time in a nutshell.
Okay. Is that interesting work? I heard you, I think it was on Manifesto's channel. You mentioned something about a drama that had something to do with the identity of America. Is that?
Yeah.
related?
Benedict hired me. He's creating a long classical music piece that is structured basically like a classical oratorio. So there's solo bits, there's choir bits. The whole thing is scored with a full orchestra. The choir is going to be large, something like 45 people. So I mean, not very large, but big enough. And he wanted me to write a libretto. But classically, a libretto is just the thing that people sing. But this was a complicated topic because he wanted to structure the thing along the narrative lines of a long prayer, of an extended prayer called the Iconostasis, Glory to God for all things, which is a long liturgical poem. Well, it's actually paraliturgical. You wouldn't really ever do it in church. It's more for private devotion. But it has 24 small stanzas, which are divided into sort of 12 sections, and the structure is chiastic, like you would see in a psalm, and it lends itself to a 3-act dramatic structure, as we found out as we started to look at it more in depth, he and I. And he wanted to write some sort of a story that would be layered on top of the structure of the Iconostasis, that would bring out the themes of the Iconostasis, but then would also sort of have this conversation through music and through text, both with the Iconostasis and with the music as he was writing it. So it's a kind of a multi-layered, multi-sensory experience of a story. And what was that story to be? He basically just sat me down and said, well, I want you to write a myth for America. And he and I both love Tolkien, and we talk about Tolkienian things all the time. So I knew exactly what he was saying. And I started to laugh because I am no Tolkien. I aspire to become Tolkien or something like him eventually in my creative life, but I have a long way to go. So he asked me to do that thing way before I was ready to provide him with a full Tolkienian experience. But we did what we could, and the resulting product, it's almost done. The storytelling portion is done. The narrative portion is done, and then the underscoring of the narrative, the musical accompaniment is almost done. And we're going to be premiering it early next year. So it's going to be something. I think it's going to be fantastic.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I had some questions at the end actually regarding American storytelling in particular. So maybe we can get to those now.
Okay.
As an American, I kind of feel disenfranchised culturally, in that there's not a whole lot of, I know you talk about rootedness. There's not. We got Walt Whitman and Edgar Allan Poe. Yeah. So I was wondering what you thought about the direction, especially Orthodox Americans can take with creative production. And I live right near St. Herman's Monastery in Platina. Okay. And so it's kind of nearby that connection with the Russian missionaries that came in 1794. I was wondering how you saw that as fitting into and defining perhaps a new kind of chapter in American self-conception. Yeah,
well, that's a very interesting question, and I suppose we could talk about that, for hours if we were to break it down to its constituent parts. But it's interesting that you mentioned Platina. I haven't had much opportunity to talk about Father Seraphim and his vision of the formation of the Christian person. But he was a person who he was not like a lot of the modern fundamentalist Orthodox, who pretend like you can have a full human experience, a full experience of being an Orthodox person without things like music, without things like literature, without things like beauty, and as though it is possible for someone recently coming to the faith or immature in the faith, which, let's be honest, is most of us, to be able to attain incredible heights of spiritual experience without first going through a formation process of the soul, of the heart, that would soften it to such a degree that the thing we're all aiming for, that direct experience of God, won't kill us just by close contact with something that is so unapproachable and something that is so perfect and something that is so beyond us, right? So how do we even do that without first doing the hard work of softening our heart? And a lot of people say, yeah, that's what prayer's supposed to do. Sure, but how can you even understand that you're praying correctly if you haven't warmed up your heart properly before you start praying? Because vain babblings repeated over and over again will only make you prouder and more content with yourself as you are, make you an absolutely horrible person to be with. And this is, I think, the legacy of Father Seraphim that is forgotten, is in that he put so much attention into forming Americans with the rich, beautiful cultural heritage of the West. I remember driving up to the monastery in Bombala, Australia, which in a lot of ways follows a similar approach to the creative and spiritual life. It's a monastery that's fascinating in a lot of ways. I was there a while back now, more than 10 years ago, but at that point there were only a few monks, and the abbot of the monastery, Father Alexei, was absolutely intent on allowing each of the monks who were there to have a rich and full creative life as part of their obedience. One of them was a carpenter, and he would make works of art out of chairs. Another one was a potter. He would work with clay, and he had a fire kiln, and he made these incredible creations that would unglazed, he would create these incredible colors out of the combinations of the kind of materials that he had, and the gradations in temperature in the fire kiln. They were so impressive, his creations so impressive, that they were featured in art galleries throughout Australia. And the way he got there was he went on an apprenticeship in Japan for years as a monk. The kind of apprenticeship where for the first year of his apprenticeship, he did nothing but sweep the floor and do things like this and watch the masters at their work. They wouldn't even be allowed to lift his hand to touch the clay, that sort of thing, right? You don't hear about this kind of attention to, what is this monk doing? How is this at all contributing to a spiritual life? And yet that is the formation of the person that has to happen before. We are complete creatures of body, spirit, and soul as well, right? We're tripartite. We need to have every single aspect of us purified, illumined. And that purification and illumination part is the part that we're going to be doing for most of our lives. And the purification part takes a long time, and it's not merely about gouging out the bad. It's also about supplanting the bad with the good. That's the ascetic tradition of the Orthodox Church. It's never about purely pulling out the weeds and leaving empty ground. You have to immediately supplant it with the appropriate virtue. And the same is true also of rooting out ugliness and replacing it with beauty. So I know this is a bit of a rabbit trail, but this is very much what I hope to see more of in the American Orthodox cultural sphere, is a recognition of the fact that we live in a young country that has not yet figured out what its own cultural heritage is. And already the cultural elites are throwing out the Western culture as insert your list of ist and etc. Negative names, right? So what are you left with except some bizarre and absolutely insane version of I will make my own identity now based on nothing.
Yeah.
And that's certainly not a way forward for any culture, nor has it been ever in the history of mankind. Why do we think that we are so special as Americans that we are going to make this utopian whatever purely based on a huge multitude of individuals who are complete solipsists and have no...
Dropped you for a minute there.
That was your side or mine?
I think it was mine. Did anything strange happen to yours?
No, nothing has strange.
Okay. My window just closed and then opened back up. That's all right.
Yeah. No, that's okay.
Yeah, solipsists.
Yeah, it's a complete self-possessed, self-enclosed solipsists that have no contact point with anybody else.
Yeah.
And that's why we have so many suicides, or one of the many reasons.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see more of that kind of exploration of the roots, and they need not necessarily be only American, because the American cultural experience is one rooted in an existing experience of many different kinds of many different cultures
Yeah.
that come mostly from immigrants,
Yeah.
as well as a rich indigenous culture, which should be mined and should, in the best sense, should be should be appropriated. Oh no, can't.
Yeah, I know.
That's
Actually,
evil, no.
yeah, I had something about that on here, and I did use the word appropriate, just because I've noticed there's such a strong affinity in some of the very like embodied interactions that have happened between Orthodox people and especially indigenous people.
Oh
It
yeah,
seems to be, well, it's because their culture is the most rooted. I mean, arguably,
Yeah.
It seems like it's very easy communication.
well, it should be. Some of them, unfortunately, have lost the language that they had maybe even 50, 100 years ago.
Yeah.
I spent a few weeks in Alaska with some indigenous Orthodox communities, and they're absolutely incredible people with tremendous faith. That it probably could move mountains if they really wanted to, but the problem is that because of some really awful things that the United States government did, especially during World War II, they lost some connection with the roots of their recently converted past. So they have things like artifacts of language that point back to Russian, but they've lost a lot of the basic knowledge of what it means to be Orthodox in some of the more distant and isolated communities that I found to be quite sad. But they're all very hungry and eager to keep the faith alive.
Yeah,
and they have much to teach us when it comes to culture.
I'm sure. Yeah. So as an American learning to reinterpret Western history and salvage and rescue important parts, because it's easy to read like Thomas Vaughan or Henry Vaughan and just see Neoplatonism, like all these issues with alchemy and white magic, and just put it aside. But at the same time, you can read it and take what you can.
I mean, that's a basic principle of spiritual life, right? You look for the all-in when you collect it.
Yeah, same Basil, right? So I've heard you talk about art as a kind of martyric activity before. Would you maybe want to expatiate on that a little bit?
I think what I was doing is quoting Alexander Pushkin. It's a bit of a romantic notion of abandoning yourself and your desires for the purposes of your art, and it can be misquoted. It can be misapplied as well, because abandoning yourself in that sense to the creative impulse is actually something quite dangerous.
Yeah, like Joyce or something.
Yeah, but what I take it to be is, I think that so asceticism is at its core adherence to a tradition of the elders. We don't practice our asceticism based on what we feel like. We don't practice it based on our own zeal. That's the worst thing you can do, because you'll burn out very quickly. Asceticism is an inherited tradition, and it's an inherited tradition that is determined, or that is described by a series of rules, but that word is so fraught with negative emotion. Let's say frames around a beautiful picture, limits beyond which you probably shouldn't go. Shrubberies to enclose beautiful gardens. And in that sense, the creative life, however you approach it, whatever your genre is, whatever you do, you probably need to, before you can become a true creator of your own work, you need to really practice working within an existing tradition. I think that's the asceticism. And that's reading a lot. That's trying out techniques that have been passed down to you. And that's also limiting yourself to the rules that those who are better than you have told you exist, whether or not you agree with them.
Certainly, yeah.
So for something as simple as genre fiction. So as opposed to literary fiction. Because that's what I write. There are certain rules that apply almost universally to anybody who wants to write successfully in the genre. Things like you have to choose a point of view and you have to stick to it. You don't change the points of view of a character within a scene ever. And things like this, things that might seem arbitrary to somebody who comes at it with a great desire to create, but without much desire to find out how that creativity or how that work is done.
Sure.
That was me at the beginning. I thought, what are these rules? I'm just gonna write what I feel like. And it comes out as a hot mess. And until you yoke yourself to the existing tradition and understand actually these rules, they correspond to larger realities that are beyond what you feel like is true or not. They have to do with certain storytelling structures and traditions that reflect merely the way people respond objectively to storytelling throughout the centuries. There's something about the structure of the human soul, the structure of the human mind that responds to certain stories better than others. That's just fact. So the more quickly you recognize that there are certain techniques, certain inherited traditions that help you create within that and make a story that then resonates with people, the faster you'll become successful in what you try to do.
Yeah, right. And there's such a proliferation now of people who think they can create their own parameters for all of these things, especially in poetry. It's a complete disaster.
Oh yeah. Poetry is a good example. Yeah.
It's pretty. So but it is a self-renunciation to have to school yourself, especially when it's not something that we do inherit in our education. It's not something that's implicit in that anymore. I think I had 5 minutes of well, in public schooling.
Yes. Fair enough.
I think I had a 10-minute scansion exercise that I had to do, and then that was good. So
and that was that.
Yeah, that's it. That's poetry.
Okay.
So yeah, it's definitely can be martyric in that way, I guess. Then maybe we can move to talking about, I was thinking about kind of the Socratic idea of midwifery.
Okay.
Especially in dialectic, in art as being necessarily dialectical, because it's between on a variety of vectors. It's between the subject and the object. It's between the perceived and the perceiver. It's between me writing something and whoever is reading it. It's dialectical in all of these ways. And there's also this sort of Socratic notion that to bring something to bear with fidelity, you have to have, in I guess Orthodox terms, you have to have a purified nous, which seems to inform the canonical structure of like icon writing and things like that.
Well, okay, let's stop there, because that's so you're going into danger zones, because it's simply not true that all iconographers have purified nousses.
Well, yeah, that's not. I meant more the I guess the forms that we start with, like dogmatic forms. I mean, in Father Pavel Florensky says functionally that the only real iconographers are saints. So that's what I meant. I'm not in practice. I mean, evidently, that would be definitely dangerous. But where I was going is maybe you could talk about how asceticism and creativity are bound together purposefully.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? Because on the one hand, it's true that to abandon yourself or to let yourself go too deeply into your creative impulse, it feels great. You know, the flow state of pure creativity is something that can fool you into thinking that it is almost a state of being in contact with the divine, and sometimes it could be.
Sure.
But if it is, it's not because you've done anything in particular. It's a gift, or it's just simply an inkling of something towards which we have to reach. And you know, speaking as a not sacred artist, right? As a writer of fiction, not as a hymnographer. This is something that I struggle with, something that I'm not sure that I have an answer to, and I'm not even sure that my spiritual father has an answer to the question of at what point does this exercise in imagination, which of course it is, at what point does it become a problem? At what point does it become,
Sure.
tending towards indulging the passions as opposed to limiting them? But I suppose that there might be something to say about not trying to dictate the end result of the thing that you make. So if you're doing this because it is an offering and because you have the gift, then you have to do everything you can, I think, to make it possible for the things that you put into the world to be transformative to yourself and to others, right? Now, if you try to force that, then you become either a preacher or a heretic.
Yeah.
So I think Ivan Nidin talks about this a lot in his Foundations of Christian Culture. The process of coming closer to God through living a spiritual life, just doing the thing you're supposed to, which we all know what we have to do, we just don't do it very well. I think the process of becoming is one that doesn't have an endpoint within this life, something that I think we forget. So that means, and Ivan Ilyin, is among many others, will support me in this, that means that the road of creativity is not close to those who are on the way towards self-purification.
Sure.
Or purification from outside, right? So you have to allow for the possibility that you are a sinner and still can create things that are transformative. If that happens, it's not you who does it.
Yeah, certainly.
But it is your work. It is your input. So on the one hand, you shouldn't be proud about it, but on the other hand, you shouldn't abandon it because this is the gift that was given you. So it's a tension, but I'm comfortable with that tension because it's dynamic, because it's something that provides a lifetime's worth of effort that could possibly and potentially actually help in one's spiritual life. So the creative act itself can be something that helps you along the road of your union with the divine. I think that's true. I think that because it's humbling, because you have to be regular about it, even when you don't feel like it. Because there's the kind of asceticism of simply showing up at your table and writing because that's what you must do, even when you don't feel like it. That's an ascetic labor,
Sure,
of a sort. So I don't know if that answers your question, but these are things that are important to struggle with and to think about, certainly.
Yeah. It seems to be something that's more embodied in Orthodox cultures and less written about. So I'm, having to sort of make my way in. And
well,
yeah, so.
I'm working on finding out more in the written tradition about this. I'm exploring in my fairy tale podcast, of all places. My fairy tale podcast, In a Certain Kingdom, has two halves to it. The first half is me retelling a story, and the second half is a kind of analysis. And in the first few seasons of it, I was focusing on more sort of the joy of the story and explaining what it might mean or some interesting aspects of it. But this time around, I'm using that as a platform to really dive into what some of the Orthodox fathers have said about the creative impulse, and specifically about the imaginative impulse, and whether or not there actually are some written things that we can find that can help us. And they're there. I found a few things, and I'm working slowly through them. So
yeah,
but not a lot of people are interested in articulating this. So
I've always kind of needed to have a conceptual framework before I could feel stable in performance. So
I jump right in.
yeah. Well, and it's something that's necessary for me. So
I understand. It's just a different approach.
Yeah.
We all have to be true to who we are, right?
yeah, definitely. Yeah. So thank you. No, that's very helpful. Let me see. What do I got here? So I have two sort of jumping off points that are tied together.
Yeah.
And one is the function of the ambiguous. And you talk about this in your articles on the Orthodox Arts Journal a little bit, with people, who have issues with sort of the, supposedly perhaps syncretic pagan elements in early, like, in some hagiography.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking, like, along the lines of characters like Merlin and these kind of liminal figures.
Yeah.
And I what came to mind when I was thinking of this was also when St. Stephen's is preaching in reference to Moses, and he says Moses learned in the arts of the Egyptians. There's that tradition of Moses having been educated in sort of these
magical rites.
Yeah, magical things. And then, there's St. Cyprian and this sort of weird, is there some sort of way in which these liminal figures function in story that's similar to fairy? Because fairy is also this liminal sort of neutral realm.
Oh yeah.
Which Tolkien is very explicit about. He's like, it's neither the path to righteousness nor the path to perdition.
Yeah.
The path to the moon. It's
and you see that also in the figure of Merlin, in that hideous strength. I mean, he embodies that in that novel very strongly. He's a figure that is ambiguous and could go either way, but even in his embrace of the good, he's still a figure of earth power, of a kind of pagan pre-Christian consciousness that can at any moment explode and actually become quite destructive to others. I don't think it's the same thing in hagiography. There certainly is a sense of how Jonathan Pedro talks a lot about the importance of the margins as opposed to the center, and the dragons are on the margins. So what hagiography does is that it allows for the expression of a reality that many people never experience, right? The reality of going out into the desert and being tempted by the devil, as Christ was during the 40 days, is not something that those who dwell in the city, to speak symbolically, often have.
Sure.
Even in our personal struggles with our passions, we're not going to see the demons come in physical form to tempt us, right? But that doesn't mean that doesn't happen. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen now. And the deliberately, not ambiguous so much as symbolic nature of the story, of the telling of the stories of the saints, is a reminder, I think, to us, a strong reminder that we need to be comfortable with the fact that what we see and what we perceive with our senses, fallen as they are, of the world fallen as it is, it's a very small percentage of what actually is going on.
Yes. Yeah.
And these stories, these wild stories of the saints, are glimpses into a reality that is more real than what we encounter on a daily basis. That's the importance of those stories. That's why we need to read them a lot. And it's not merely because there's so many of them are martyr stories and it's a reminder to us that we must suffer, but it's also that so many of them have these fantastical encounters with beasts on the margins and with demons and with forces outside of our ken, because that's the reality. That is what this life is about. And if we don't see it, that's because we haven't reached that level.
Yeah. 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 So I think that's something that's perhaps in fairy stories that's not elsewhere in an important way, is that dealing with the kind of oniric and not as sober. It's the
so the function of fairy is similar. It's not the same, but it's similar. I think the function of fairy and fairy stories is to widen the perception of, rather it is to not to widen the perception. No, that's not right. That it's to widen the perception of the modern person who has no conception of there being anything but the material reality. That's certainly true, but that's not the traditional usage,
right?
Not the traditional benefit of fairy, of fairy stories. It is I think it is to confirm the instinct that children have, that yes, this world is far broader, far taller, far deeper than you think, than you imagine, than you see, right?
Right. It's sort of
Um,
concretization of those intuitions.
Yeah, because children understand.
Yeah.
That's why they love those stories, because they're closer to what we're supposed to be, or what Adam was supposed to be.
Yeah.
They haven't fully partaken of the sins of the fall.
Yeah. Here, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. That's all right. I'm getting an error message on my Zoom. I need to see why.
Looks like the session is about to expire.
Oh, that may be it. I wasn't anticipating that. I thought they had gotten rid of that I guess COVID's over now, so they reinstituted.
Oh, yeah.
I had forgotten.
You were getting Zoom for free?
I was, silly me. Well, actually that almost rounds out most of the questions that I had. Do you have any place you'd like to direct people in particular? I know you have a website.
I have a website that's
named after you.
Yeah, that's where I put all the stuff. Make concrete the ambiguous. It's on the website.
Yeah.
So that's a place where you can find all the crazy things I do.
And a podcast on ancient faith. I'll plug you for you. And you have a book, right? Or you have multiple books, many translations. By the way, I want to get my hands on The Cross of Loneliness. Read that. But Raven's Son is well worth reading. I finished the first book a couple of days ago, and found it very, very. It was very holistic.
Good. That's what I hope for.
Yeah. So I appreciated that, and I appreciate your time. I know we had a little bit of a rough go doing this, but
that's okay.